most people, when they taste success, they cling on to that thing so much because they're scared of messing it up. Really successful people taste success and then they fight complacency. They think about failure as a key to learning and a step in the right direction. So the faster that I iterate, or the faster that I fail, the faster that I can iterate, the faster I can get to my destination.
So hey Polina, how are you? You're doing well?
I'm great. I'm excited to be here.
Yep. It's my pleasure to have you on. So I think let's just get into it. So who is Polina Pompliano? Who are you?
Who are you? Big question. I am many things. Writer, mother, like all sorts of labels. But I'd like to think of myself as somebody who just likes to learn from other people. And I've taken that love for learning and made it my career.
I think this is a good way to get into the real part of what is the book about? What is Hidden Genius the book that you've written?
Yeah. So, okay. So like I said, I really like learning, but when I was in school, I realized that there are different styles of learning and different types of learning. And the way that I learned was different from other kids. So in history tests, they would ask you for exact dates and historical events and names and places. And I just couldn't remember all of those facts. So I was like, okay, I need a better way than just memorizing it. And that better way was, I found, people-focused learning. So I would find a story or a person who was interesting in that historical period and then try to frame everything around them. So in the book, the example that I use is Marie Antoinette in the French Revolution. I was like, why did people hate her so much? What did she do? She was this young queen that became a symbol of excess, and all the commoners hated her because they didn't have money. She had everything. And they ultimately, all this chaos led to her execution with the guillotine. And that was like a very emotionally charged story for me. And I was able to remember a lot of things by trying to empathize with the person. So I was trying to be like, okay, what was she thinking? What was she probably feeling? How did the other people feel? Why was she so hated? Those things cemented the names, places, and dates in my head better than if I was just memorizing them cold. So the point of this book is if people's stories are at the center of any learning pursuit, how can I take all these people's stories, extract the things that I think they're best at, and help readers find their own hidden genius? And hidden genius I define as that unique set of experiences or skill sets or that X factor that we all have. It's just some of us haven't quite discovered it yet.
Yeah. You've profiled over like 1,300 people. So when I was researching for this, when I was preparing the document for this and looking at it in the background, the way I looked at it during the research in the nicest way possible, I thought that if a person profiles this many people, read about this many people in such detail, you're kind of like a large language model for data about different people. So that's the way I looked at it. Is that a correct description? No, I put it that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's just like, and it's interesting because it's not that I remember every story or like every fact or whatever. It's just that the ones that stick with me are the ones that I included in the book and the ones that I've kind of baked into my own life. And after reading about so many people, you start, like you said, like you start developing patterns and you start seeing things that are repetitive. And you're like, how is Kris Jenner from the Kardashians similar to Melinda Gates? Like totally different people, yet they have something in common. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. You talked about commonness there. What do you think is common between the mindset that relatively successful people have, which others lack?
So the first part is that they're willing to fail in the name of creating something truly original. Most people um, when they taste success, they cling on to that thing so much because they're scared of messing it up. Really successful people taste success and then they fight complacency. They don't want to become complacent. They are actively trying new things that may fail to stay on top or to innovate even more. And so I think that the first part is the way they think about failure is different from how everybody else thinks about failure. They think about failure as a key learning and a step in the right direction. So the faster that I iterate, or the faster that I fail, the faster that I can iterate, the faster I can get to my destination. Um, and and they see, like, for example, let's say I fail, most people think, oh, I'm starting over, I'm starting from zero, I have to start from scratch again. And that was really demotivating to them. But really successful people are like, okay, I failed, but I now have this mountain of experience and mountain of skill sets that I have acquired because of this failure that I'm not starting over. I'm actually starting over from up here and I can continue to build on it. And the second part to that is they know that even if they fail, even if they fall flat on their face, they can always reinvent. And whether it's in the same industry, whether it's in a different way, they just know that they can bet on themselves to have the skill set necessary to reinvent in some other way. For example, Martha Stewart was super successful in the early 2000s. You know, everybody knew her name. She was a billionaire. And then she went to prison for insider trading and everybody thought it was over for her. But except for Martha Stewart. So she was like, I'm going to reinvent. And because she has so many different times, that's why she's relevant to my grandmother's generation, my mother's generation, and my generation. Everybody knows who Martha Stewart is. And her brand keeps evolving, even though she failed in this massive way.
Yeah, that's an incredible thing. So on the last part, how do people believe in themselves when like no one does?
How do you believe in yourself when nobody else does? That's a really good question. So when I was making the decision to leave Fortune magazine and bet on myself to do the profile full time, I kept going back and forth and I was very indecisive and I didn't know. I was like, can a writer be a founder? Like, I don't know anything. Well, I write about business, but I have never started a business myself. And Anthony, my husband, said, never let anybody else believe in you more than you believe in yourself. And I think that's so important because it's like, if you yourself don't have the confidence to think that you can make it and that you can better yourself and have the skills necessary to achieve this big thing that you want, why should anybody else? And that's why I think like the most successful founders in particular have this small belief. It's almost like a delusional belief that they can make it, even if they're not the most experienced or the most skilled or the most talented. They have a slight level of delusion where like, I can, bend the world to, or bend reality to my vision, and they make it happen. Sometimes it blows up in their face, as we've seen with a number of founders, but other times like that self-confidence pushes them in the face of what a lot of other people would have killed their idea. So again, to go back to Sarah Blakely as an example, she says that she believes every single person in their lifetime has had $1 million idea. She's like, everybody's had one. The problem is when you tell a friend or you tell a family member, they're like, if it was that good, somebody else would have done it already. Or, why you? And they say little comments that kill your self-esteem about it. So then you just don't pursue it. When she started Spanx, she didn't tell anybody for a whole year until she had her patent in place, until she had founded the company officially, until she had made her first sale. So it's like, you have to be very deliberate about who you tell early on, because if you tell the wrong people about an idea, the early phases are when it can die.
Where does the line between delusion and naivety end?
It's a good question. I think to believe in so obviously, like, being insecure is very common, especially when you're younger and you don't have a lot of experience. But um, to me, confidence and believing in yourself comes from keeping daily promises that you make to yourself, whether it's as simple as like, I'm going to go work out today. If you don't do that, that's breaking a promise to yourself. And that kind of kills that level of confidence a little bit. It's like, make really small promises to yourself and keeping them to yourself and executing on them until you start building confidence and until you're so sure of an idea or you're so sure of yourself that no matter what other people say, you're like, I've already thought about that. I appreciate the criticism, but I've already like thought about that. And I think that's where confidence comes from, because insecurity is so easy when you kind of have a half-baked idea, somebody criticizes it, you take it personally, and then you're like, I'm never going to do that again. So confidence to me is like the level of how much do you keep your promises to yourself and how willing are you to take constructive criticism without internalizing it as like a personal attack.
Yeah, for sure. I think based on this point, how do people who, if they develop a mindset of confidence in themselves, how do they kind of refrain from taking criticism from the public? In that scenario, it is easy to give up, but how do they build on top of the criticism?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's like, so criticism inherently is a good thing. You want to attack an idea from all sides to make sure that it stays. I think that they had the confidence that them as partners had enough experience and failures and whatever to find this pain point that the market needed from their unique seats in the industry to be like, no, the market needs this. And we sometimes you have to understand that when you get criticism, it's less about uh, the idea and it's more about people's unique experiences and them being like, I don't actually know that I need this, but I know I don't want it. And it's like, no, you'll use it if your customers use it. So that's kind of an example with Square, but I think it's Kat Cole always says, when you get criticized, the first thing you should do is assume it's true. And then like that allows you to identify any blind spots, poke holes in the idea if necessary, and then be like, okay, I've accounted for all this stuff. Do I still believe in it? And if the answer is yes, you proceed. And it's just like, it's a cyclical process constantly.
How did you deal with criticism when writing the book?
Well, I didn't tell anybody. So I didn't tell anybody I was writing a book just because A, I didn't think I would finish it, and B, I didn't want to hear their opinions at that time.
Yeah.
So I told people that I was writing a book when I had finished it and there was an Amazon link to pre-order it. At that point, I felt strongly enough that I had already written it. So even if it was bad, I would learn that later. But I had Anthony and my parents. Those were the only people that I sent early drafts to. I just wanted to make sure that it was readable. You know, they were kind of my target audience. And I was like, does it make sense? And is it fun to read? And of course, like, for example, if they'd be like, this doesn't make sense, or these two ideas are a little bit disjointed, maybe you should move things. I also had an editor who was really helpful. But after I've been writing in public for like more than a decade. So to me, I don't take criticism of my writing personally anymore. I've developed a very, very, very thick skin when it comes to that, just because I know who it comes from determines whether they want to genuinely make it better. When I'm writing the profile, I send the newsletter out. If people don't like something that I wrote, they immediately write back. And then I know these are people who are rooting for you. Like, these are subscribers. They want this product to be better. So I always take it into account. And this happened recently. I told the person, I was like, I really appreciate that feedback. We will improve on this. Thank you for sending it. So it's not, I understand it's not coming from a place where they want to tear Polina down. It's coming from a place where it's like, this is going to help make you better. And if I look at early versions of the book, early versions of the newsletter, it was so bad. And then it just got better as people kept giving me small nuggets of criticism.
Yeah. How much better will it get from here onwards? Like, you have been in this for a very long time. Does the betterment slow down over time? Or do you think the difference between where it is now from where you started out will be different from where it will be in 20 years?
Oh, totally. Yeah, for sure. I think, I've only been writing it for only 6 years, 7 years. And since I started in 2017, the profile with the newsletter, and if you look at the first edition, it's so different from what it is now, but like the bare bones are there, which are, I'm going to recommend 7 or 8 really interesting high profile or in-depth high quality profiles that you can read about interesting people or companies. That was the promise. The wrapper looks way different. But I once heard Ira Glass, who created the wildly successful radio program and podcast, This American Life. He talks about how when you're first starting out, you have taste, and you probably have really good taste, but you don't yet have the skills to make it really good. And so your level of quality isn't there, but your taste is there. And he's like, over a long period of time, that gap starts to close. And so the quality and your taste start to come together versus, really good taste, really bad quality. And that's kind of how it always starts out. With Humans of New York, is same thing. It started with one thing and it turned into something different. I'm sure your podcast will start as something and turn into something slightly different. It's just like being, again, like I said before, constantly reinventing and not thinking that something is quote unquote perfect, opening yourself up to criticism and then tweaking it along the way. You'll find what people like, and you'll find what's high quality. And if you have good taste, you can make it something really, really good and like valuable for people.
Yeah, for sure. But when you're starting out, you don't really have a lot of people to criticize you. So you are...
Find them.
Yeah.
There's always somebody. There's always somebody who is willing to give you like constructive feedback.
But people who are relatively successful, do they start to neglect feedback when they get it?
Yeah. So I would say that the people who are successful once neglect feedback. The people who are successful twice or more times do not. And I say that because Grant Achatz, who I feature in the book, he's a really successful chef and entrepreneur. And his restaurant, Alinea, is one of the most innovative restaurants in the world. And from him, I learned that if something is successful, you don't do it again, which is counterintuitive. He will have a menu that he's crafted for the diners, and he tells his team every 6 months, I want you to blow up the menu and start over. And his team was like, why? This is the best thing that we've ever created. And he's like, exactly. Like, that's why you have to blow it up and start over, because it's going to make you even more innovative. Otherwise, like, what are we doing? We're not pushing ourselves. We're not trying new things. We're not taking risks. And I think that people who are successful one time, they're so scared to lose that. Some inevitably do, because if you're not being intentional about something, even if it's really good, this is true in like life, career, relationships, even if it's really good, if you don't consistently put effort and time into it and you're not intentional about it, it'll erode. And I think it's the same with success. Like, if you're not constantly breaking it and starting over. For example, I'm right now rethinking my newsletter and how I'm formatting it and what I'm including. Should I have more original interviews? Should I do this? But like, if I'm not having those thoughts and having those conversations with people, I'll never grow, and the newsletter will never grow. It'll just kind of stay stagnant.
Yeah, that's incredible. I think that's why innovation is important. That's what Jim McElmee talks a lot about developing.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think I'll pivot here a little bit. In the book, you mentioned the part about finding the connection between the unconnected. What is that about?
Yeah. So research shows that a lot of times in our brains, we'll naturally find connections between two totally unrelated things if we think about them for long enough. So if you give me two different words or two different ideas, my brain will start finding connections between them, even if there aren't any obvious connections to be made between them. So really creative people use that as a technique where they're like, okay, I'm in the restaurant business, but I can go get an idea from a museum or a rock concert or just watching leaves fall to the ground at the park. You find ideas in the most random places because you're thinking about the dining experience, but then you're also allowing your brain to take these new inputs from random places and hold those there too. So then it's a really good way to start generating ideas because your brain will be like, whoa, what if, the way the song sounds and the tempo of the song, you can apply as a storytelling technique to the dining experience. So it's like creativity is truly just connecting two or more unconnected things together.
Connect any... How does a person connect anything?
How does anyone connect anything? Great question. Okay. So for example, this is what I was just talking about. So Grant Achatz, the chef, he's a chef. He has no business going to a museum, looking at a painting and saying, I want to eat off of that. But that's exactly what he did because he sees the world through what he calls a kaleidoscope of food. So the lens that he sees the world through is a lens of food. But everything he encounters is an opportunity to get an idea from that and apply it to his restaurant, for example. So when he sees that painting, he's like, I want to eat off of that. He's like, but why can't I? And then he thinks, wow, what if the tablecloth wasn't just a white tablecloth that we normally have? What if instead we paint it with sauces and chocolates and whatever to make it look like a large scale painting that people can eat off of directly from the tablecloth without using utensils, and it's just like that kind of thing is he's connecting two different ideas from two different industries that wouldn't normally be connected together. Da Vinci used to do the same thing. He would throw a sponge filled with paint up against the wall and then look at the images as it dripped down on the wall and be like, oh, that's interesting. And that's how he would get an idea. Those are things that are like connecting the unconnected because the things that are obvious have probably been done and they're not as original anymore. The things that you can connect that aren't obvious is where like originality
lies. But how do you keep the originality in mind while connecting the unconnected? Like you talked about, if you add the paintings from the museum in the restaurant, then how do you actually keep the originality which you started
out? You keep getting ideas from your life. So for example, for me, 2020, when the pandemic hit and we all had to stay at home, it was really hard to generate new ideas because the way I get new ideas is I overhear a conversation at a coffee shop and that gives me an idea for something to write, or I talk to a friend and they say something and I bounce ideas off of. 2020 made you super isolated. And what Anthony and I did was we were walking down the street, just us. There was nobody in New York City. And as we're walking, I started paying attention to like all the businesses that had shut down. And I was like, wow, like that's crazy. I wonder about the people behind the buildings, the people behind the businesses. Most people would see that and be like, man, that sucks. My gym's no longer here. But because I see it through a lens of people, I was constantly thinking about the human beings behind the things. So that led to like a 7-part series that I wrote for the profile called The Faces of American Business. And I profiled some of these business owners. So I think part of originality is also like noticing, being super, super aware of the world and not letting it just be a blur and identifying things like even on a walk. What new thing can you see that you haven't noticed before can give you some really good ideas.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, yeah, it was a zombie apocalypse in that day.
Yeah.
So you talked about creativity there, but why should founders, people who want to build something, really be creative, be technical? Why is it important?
Well, creativity is important in any endeavor, especially a business, because I think we've seen what happens when some of these big corporations stop innovating and they start getting their market share eaten by these small startups. The small startup is super focused, they're super agile, and they're super creative. They have fresh ideas. It takes a while for the big corporation either to catch up or to recognize it's a good idea or to pivot as fast. So as the small startups starts eating market share, and then it ends up disrupting the big company, the incumbent. So if you don't constantly disrupt yourself, Apple is a good example of a large company that's constantly innovating and disrupting itself. Or if they can't disrupt themselves, they buy another company. That's the key to kind of staying on top, is not letting yourself stay stagnant, because that's the worst. If you have one product, one good idea, and your competitor has, maybe they failed 50 times, but then they generated 100 new ideas, then you're in trouble, because you may have been successful one time, but they're going to eat your lunch.
That's a good point. But how do you talk about manufacturing creativity? How does the person really manufacture creativity?
Oh my gosh, so many ways. Well, so first of all, it's what I mentioned, kind of start noticing the world and be aware. 2, it's sometimes creativity can happen when you have a problem to solve, but you don't actually have a solution for it. You don't know how to solve it. And you're like thinking about it, maybe actively, you can't come up with a solution. But then what your brain does is, when you leave it alone, you go do something else, and it starts to working in the background to either generate new ideas to solve the problem or something like that. So that's why a lot of really creative people, they take on a project, then they step away from the project, and then they go do something else. Oftentimes it's rote activities like walking, running, meditating, shaving, showering, driving. Those are all ways that you're doing something that you're not actively thinking about, but it's allowing your brain in the background to work. And that's why most people have their best ideas in the shower or on a run or something like that. You're doing a repetitive activity that doesn't require active brain power to think about. So your brain's working on other things in the background. Sarah Blakely, when she was coming up with the idea for Spanx, she had a really long commute, so she had to drive a really long distance. As she was driving, she kept getting ideas, and she was like, "Oh, there must be something to this." So then, when her office was really close to her house, she started going different ways just so she could spend more time in the car, because she knew that that's where she had her best ideas. So kind of like manufacturing creativity is this idea that there is no muse, no one moment of inspiration. It's like daily active work, butt in chair. You have to sit down and do the work. And from there, creativity it's like a skill. It's not a moment of inspiration that you wait for.
I think I'll go off topic a little bit, but is there a specific reason as to why you mentioned Sarah Blakely a lot? Even her
Yes,
book and
she was the first profile dossier I wrote for my newsletter. She's kind of the reason that when I had first moved to New York as like a 22-year-old, I was kind of lost. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I came across her story and I was really inspired by what she had done. And so I started reading everything I could about her, watching everything, listening to everything she'd done, to the point where I was like, whoa, I can learn so much from her, even though I'm not necessarily on the path at the time to start my own business. But I'm curious from I'm a lost 20-something-year-old perspective. How do you find like what you're supposed to do? And she was so practical in her delivery that I found it really useful to study her story. So she's kind of truly the inspiration for the people-focused learning that then led to the profile that then led to the book.
yeah. You talked about being lost as a 20-year-old. Why are people really lost at 20?
I think it's because my theory is that from the moment you are born to the moment that you graduate from high school or college or whatever, you have identities given to you by society that you never had to think about. So when you're a child, you're just like playing, whatever. Then you start first grade. Now you're a student. And then from there, depending on what you do, you're either, for me, I was a student, an intern, a college newspaper editor. Like I had all these critical labels or identities that when I graduated and I stepped out into the real world, I was like, holy cow, like, okay, I have all this stuff, but who am I? Like, who is Polina? Because a lot of other people have the same exact identities as me. And suddenly I no longer felt important or respected or like I had an identity in who I was. So I think that's why a lot of people in their early 20s, they gotta get smacked in the face by life. And they're like, wait a second, I don't have anything that I only do for myself that differentiates me from everybody else. And when you have an identity crisis, it's like very dangerous because your confidence, your self-worth, your self-esteem is all tied to that. So for example, if you get fired from a job and you lose that identity, you're like, oh man, I took a hit. Like it feels really personal, even though it's something external. So with the profile of my newsletter, I'm assuming what you're doing with your podcast, it's something that nobody can ever fire you from. You are in full control of that project or venture that you only do for yourself. And that's, I think, ultimately the most powerful position to be in.
Yeah, for sure. I'm crazy enough to fire myself. But yeah, that's the all right. I'll get back to the topic. But when you're as a 20-year-old, when you like were finding your real identity, what was really tough about it?
What was tough about it is like I didn't know that you could create your own identity. I always thought it had to be external and that it had to be a stamp of validation from an outside authority figure. So honestly, it wasn't until I met Anthony that I was like, oh, wait a second. Like there's this world of people who self-validate and they don't rely on like institutions to validate them for them. So I had always derived confidence and validation from my job. So I thought like where you work was determined how successful you were. So I would attribute success to all these external factors like your job title, status, money, where you lived, all this stuff that doesn't actually matter. And then when I met Anthony, I was like, oh, okay. So like you do a whole bunch of different things. You don't identify in one specific way. That's interesting. And I think this is why now I have such a hard time when people ask me, like, what do you do or who are you? Because it's like, I do so many different things. I don't think of myself as just one type of person. And I think that that's ultimately why it's so hard when you're young, is because you don't know that you can give that to yourself.
Yeah, I started with that question. Who are you?
Exactly.
But you have related to this. You became mentally tough after meeting Anthony. But what you see after you have profiled and interviewed so many people, what creates them mentally tough to deal with tough situations?
I think that the most mentally tough people don't wait to be tough in once something challenging comes across. I think they make it a practice every day. So, for example, David Goggins, former Navy SEAL, current extreme athlete, for him, it's something very physical. He's like, every single day, I'm going to go on a run, regardless of what it's like outside. Raining, snowing, blizzarding, I'm going. That idea is that he says, do one thing that sucks every day that you don't want to do. And he's like, that will callous the mind and create some mental friction for you so that when the really big physical challenges come around, you're prepared. I think about it in the same way, but like you can do it with not just physical challenges. You can do it with mental things as well. So, for example, if you hate negotiating, you shouldn't wait until you have to negotiate a really big business deal or a salary with your boss. You should create moments in your day that require for you to practice negotiating. And it's something that you don't want to do that feels unnatural and uncomfortable, but you're doing it every day to prepare for that big moment. So for me, that was public speaking. So I would create moments in my life where I was like, I'm going to force myself to speak to a larger group. Maybe it was in front of my friends. Maybe it was at a small moderating event, something like that. I would say yes to everything so that I could practice public speaking, so that when I had to give a speech in front of 500 people, I didn't freeze. So it's like, I think the most mentally tough and most successful people understand that it's the tiny things that build up to that big event, instead of waiting for the big event to happen and then be like, okay, am I mentally tough? It's like theory versus reality and like practicality.
Yeah. When you gave the example of public speaking, when you actually went in front of the 500 people or a larger group,
Yeah.
how do you actually deal with the change in the scenario? Because there is a change, a big change, no matter how tough you are in general.
Yeah.
But how does the person deal with that?
So I obviously had never done it before, and I recently did it a few months ago. It's terrifying. But so I talk about this idea in the book, this idea of creating an alter ego. When you're you, and I'm pretty introverted, like I can turn it on, but I'm relatively like introverted. And I don't like being the center of attention at all. But I knew that in order to be a reporter, I had to moderate conferences. In order to be a successful author, I had to speak probably in front of larger groups. So if you know that, okay, so for one way to do this practically is I was like, who is the best interviewer in the world? If I want to get better at interviewing on a stage, for example, who can I learn from? Oprah comes to mind as one of the best interviewers in the world. I literally sat and watched so many videos of her interviewing people. And I was like, look at how she leans in. At what moments does she follow up with a question? When does she interrupt them? Like specific things like that. After a while, when it's so visual, you start absorbing it. And you start absorbing it subconsciously, but then you get a chance to practice it on the stage. And like when you're like, oh, okay, I'm introverted Polina, but when I step on stage, I'm like gonna be the best interviewer you've ever seen. Just telling yourself that is helpful. But the concept of an alter ego is that you're one person here, you're another person here. It's almost performative. So Beyonce, for example, super shy in real life, but on stage, she's a powerhouse. She gave her alter ego a name. She was like, I'm going to be Sasha Fierce. I don't know why she chose that, but that's what came to her mind. And she's like, in my real life, I would never dance like that. I would never dress like that. I would never be so confident. But here I can express that part of my identity. And what you'll notice over time is that I think of it more, less of an alter ego and more of like an aspirational self. It's like, who is the person you want to become? And if you want to be a more confident public speaker, you should start acting like that person today. So start putting yourself in those situations and start being like, I'm good at this. Self-talk is really important, as we've seen. It's a common thing now, but for me, when I was speaking in front of those 500 people, all I could think about is like, right now, you are not Polina. Right now, you're like the best public speaker these people have ever seen. Actually, when I was walking on stage, I was like, well, I promised the conference organizers that this is going to be I'm going to be the Beyonce of speeches. So here I am. And it was like a joke, but I'm also setting it up for like, this is about to be a really good thing. So I think it's part of that. It's like, study the people who have had alter egos like Beyonce or Kobe Bryant, people like that, or study the people that you find inspiring in your field and watch them, listen to them, and take note of the things they do. And take the things that you like and start to imitate that until it becomes part of your identity.
Does a feeling of sadness instill inside a person when they can't live up to their aspirational self?
Probably. I think that in the book that I talk about this like really interesting idea of before you know who you are, before you know who your aspirational self is, you have to know who you are not. And the reason that's important is because it's easier for humans to know who they don't want to be before they know who they do want to be. And so if you know that you don't want to be the type of person that breaks their promises, you don't want to be the type of person that is a bad business partner or things like that, it's easier to eliminate the bad habits than it is to create good new ones. So start with be like, this is not the person that I want to be. So I'm going to start acting as if I am not that person. And then from there, you can start implementing new things that you do want to tweak. But it's easier to eliminate the bad than implement the good. And that way, you can start living up to your goals and being your aspirational self immediately if you just start with eliminating the negative.
Does the alter ego, if a founder does have an alter ego that they use when they're in front of their team or something, how does the team develop trust in the person, the aspirational person, whereas the person who he is in reality?
Yeah, well, it's not about like shifting values. I think who you are as a person is who you are as a person. It's more of a mental crutch that allows you to like get to create some distance between yourself and your aspirational self. So it's not that suddenly like, oh, I'm this person, I have these values and I'm changing my foundational values. It's more about like how you perceive, how I seem in front of an audience generally. With Kobe Bryant, it was that he was really, really disliked to the point where he would step onto the court and people would boo him. He was like, I can't focus on that right now. I need to create this like alter ego where I'm the Black Mamba and I'm this amazing player. But he was still Kobe, like he had the same values. I think, especially with founders, like if you're, uncomfortable speaking in front of a large team or something like that, it's helpful to add a little distance and maybe create like an alter ego who is a good public speaker, but not necessarily like I'm a totally different person with different values, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. That does make sense. In the book too, you also talk about relationships and building and trust building. Um, so in addition to the alter ego, how does a founder or any person in general build trust with people that they want?
Yeah, one simple formula that I heard from LinkedIn founder Reid Hoffman is consistency plus time equals trust. So if you're the type of person who delivers on their promises consistently over a long period of time, you can start earning trust that it's inevitable because people know that you're the type of person that stands by their word. And Toby Lutke from Shopify founder, he has a really interesting framework where he says that everybody that you meet, you start out, and he thinks about it as like a battery, a trust battery. You both start at 50% charged, and every interaction that you have either charges it or discharges it a little bit. So he's like, aim to be the type of person whose trust battery stays charged at over 80%. And what he means by that is like 20% of the time, stuff is going to come up. You're not going to be able to make your meeting. You're not going to be able to meet for coffee, whatever. But 80% of the time, you keep your promises. And I think that that's really important in business and life and relationships, because relationships are truly the most foundational key or aspect of any endeavor that you may take in your life.
Does trust build relationship, or do relationships build trust?
Well, that's a very good question. It's like chicken or the egg. I think that, well, the way I operate is like I automatically trust you until I have a reason not to. And I think that a lot of people could and would probably take advantage of that, but then I won't trust them anymore. And I think more guarded people tend to be like, oh, I'm just going to see if I can trust this person before I do. But I really do think that like the time element of it is like, it'll reveal everything. Naval Ravikant says how if you've known somebody for 20 years and you already know what kind of person they are, whether you can trust them, you can do a deal without documents. It's just like a handshake, and you know that's a done deal. Whereas if you're a younger founder, you have to be much more careful and skeptical when you're striking business deals, because obviously you haven't had enough interactions with this person to develop trust. So it's like you need both, because one without the other, you can't have it.
For sure. And what have you noticed in great leaders and how they build trust with the people around them, or how they treat the people around them differently from others?
So in the book, I talk about this case at Spotify where Daniel Ek is the CEO, and now like Spotify started very small and has now ballooned into this big organization. And there was a small engineering team within Spotify that was tasked with like coming up with new features and ideas and things like that. So they came to Daniel and they were like, we have this idea for a personalized playlist for every listener. And Daniel was like, I mean, that's a cool feature, but like I wouldn't spend all my time working on that. And they said, okay. And so he said, if it was up to me, I would have killed it. But they continued working on it. And then one day, Daniel's reading the news and he sees, oh, Spotify launches this new feature called Discover Weekly. That's a personalized personalized playlist for every listener. And he was like, wait, what? So his team, so first of all, there's a lot of trust going on because he trusted his team well enough to not have him approve every single thing that launches to the public. His team trusted him enough to know that they wouldn't get fired if they launched this to the public without his approval. In a very stringent top-down organization, you would never do that. You would never launch something to the public without the CEO's knowledge. So Daniel, to his credit, admits that if it was up to him, he would have killed that. And Discover Weekly has actually become one of the most beloved and popular features of Spotify. And so it's just an example of like trusting your team and showing that innovation can only happen if there's mutual trust there.
But do people develop an ego which comes in between the trust among the top-down organization, among the CEO or the founder and the team?
If it's a top-down organization, there's probably a lot more ego with the CEO than if it was what Daniel Ek talks about with Spotify, which is like a bottoms-up organization where the people who are on the ground every day are empowered to do their jobs and come up with new ideas. And the CEO's only role is to kind of empower them and encourage them and give them resources instead of telling them, you're going to work on this and you're going to work on this. I think the top-down leaders have much more of an ego, and like lack of reality than the bottom up leaders.
Yeah, that's I mean, so you actually I think you talked about this on Danny's podcast. You interviewed I hope I don't get this wrong. General Electric's CEO.
Yep, Jeff, yeah.
Jeff, yeah. So when talking to a person, General Electric is relatively a big company, from what I know. When you talk to people like these, do they show a sense of ego when being talked to?
Everybody does this. Absolutely. Because you have to have, so you have to have an ego to do anything, I think, especially be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I mean, you have to have an ego, but you also have to have a humility that Jeff demonstrated in that podcast, where I asked him, I was like, listen, like shareholder value significantly went down during your term. Jack Welch, who was your predecessor, people loved him. He was really well admired. And you kind of took the company and a lot of people lost money. How would you respond to that? And he wrote a book. And at the end of the book, he lists every single mistake that he made. And then he explains why he made it and how he tried to recover from it and all this stuff. So it's like the best leaders exemplify a level of humility that that others don't. And another thing I learned is from Mark Bertolini. He was the former CEO of Aetna. Then he became the co-CEO of Bridgewater. Now he's at a startup, but he said that he developed this framework called the 4 levels of Taoist leadership. And he was like, the first level is that the employees hate you. The second level is that they fear you. The third level is that they praise you. And the fourth level is that you're invisible. So the whole idea is that make yourself, redundant. If you do a great job as a CEO, the organization doesn't need you anymore. Like that's the whole point, is that I think a lot of great leaders miss, is that if you've built the right culture, employed the right people, and created a really great product, ultimately the organization can run itself. It's not totally dependent on you, which is key risk.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think those are incredible points. I like the 4 parts there, but I think I'll just have a personal question from that. What does the last part really signify then, being invisible?
Being an invisible leader. So what Bertolini did at Aetna is he prepared the company so well, and it was such a well-oiled machine that when he shepherded the sale to CVS Health, it was seamless because they didn't need him anymore. It was the company could run itself under new leadership, under new whatever. It wasn't dependent on him and his skills anymore, because he had like downloaded the knowledge to everybody else. And I think it's very counterintuitive, because most CEOs and most leaders want to say, I'm irreplaceable. You shouldn't fire me because I'm the key and I'm the glue to this organization. It's like, that's the opposite of what you should do. You should prepare the organization to run smoothly without you, becoming an invisible leader.
Yeah. He found us hidden genius. Shameless plug. But what is your hidden genius? Let's end with that.
What is my hidden genius?
Yeah.
I think my hidden genius, if I may say so myself, is that I'm really good at meeting people and extracting their essence and like what makes them them, and being able to tell not just like what type of person this is, but like what makes them, what excites them, what motivates them, like what their hidden genius is. But I'm just really good at like extracting the practical lessons from somebody's life journey, and translating them for other people so they can learn too.
I was correct about the large language model thing. But yeah, awesome. So I think that's it from my side. Anything you'd like to say?
Awesome. No, that's it. I think this is a really good conversation. We covered a lot of ground, so I hope people like it.
Yeah, for sure.